All right, and welcome back to another episode of Who's Lifting Today. We're going to talk about what I think is like a really important topic, and it's not something that I've really covered on the podcast yet. So I'm pretty excited for this, and I think that it's something that is missed a lot, and we need to talk about more. In a previous podcast episode, I talked about how to make time for training. For people who have like a really busy schedule, they have young kids or a busy job or whatever it might be, like how do they actually make the time just because they are so busy? And that's still pretty important to talk about and is something that can be overcome, but it just requires a little more strategic planning. However, as the years of training have gone by, there's another thing that I've noticed that comes up, and it is not people who have a lack of time necessarily, but who refuse to make the time out of guilt even if they do have the time. And I think like that's something that we need to talk about as well, is that there's real shame or guilt in making time for yourself. And this is something that I want to talk about. This comes from, this could be pressure from families and friends. This could be, you feel like you should be using your time to help other people, whether it's young kids or your husband, or like you're at your job with your boss or coworkers. And it ends up being that like there is almost like shame for making time to train because there's this feeling that you should be prioritizing your time in other ways. I want to start by saying, I'm not here to shame anybody for not making the time. I'm more just trying to understand why, as well as ways that we can kind of like why you should make that time anyways. Because while I understand you're prioritizing other things in your life and fitness is not your life, so it is understandable that you are going to prioritize other things that exist. I'm never going to tell you don't, go to your kid's soccer practice or help them with homework because you should be squatting instead. Like that's never going to happen. And I don't want you to do that. I do think there is this real issue where there's shame for making time for yourself, even when you have the time and don't necessarily need to be focusing on those things. And there's kind of like this guilt that needs to be pushed to the side for like your own goals. And we're going to kind of talk about like what happens if you keep doing this long term, as well as like why you should make time for yourself, not only for yourself, but for the other aspects of your life, because this is not an all or nothing thing, and it doesn't need to be an all or nothing thing. But making time for yourself and not feeling guilty for making time for yourself is going to be important for your life as well as your strength journey. The first thing I want to talk about, and this is probably something you have felt or something that is coming up, is burnout. And burnout is a real thing that exists. This exists a lot for people who have really stressful jobs, or they have young kids, or they're in like a stressful relationship or whatever it might be. And burnout is really, really tough. And two things happen when burnout happens, when you don't make time for yourself. The first is it's not necessarily that the main thing that you're doing becomes worse. It is that all the things around it become worse. So like as an example, someone who doesn't make time for themselves because they feel like they should be like working extra hours to like start their business, or they feel like they should be spending more time being like a good mom and being with the kids. That main thing doesn't necessarily get worse with burnout. What does happen is all the other aspects of your life get worse around that. So you almost like, you don't have the energy to do other things, or you're barely scraping by. So you end up like sacrificing other aspects of your life for the sake of this one thing. So I'm not here like, it's not necessarily the case that, if you're feeling burnt out because like having kids is stressful, it's not that you're going to become like a worse parent. It's that you're going to sacrifice your health in the process, your other hobbies in the process, maybe other relationships in your life for the sake of like your kids, which is like totally understandable, but can cause real, and this is like where the burnout would happen, is that like you end up really prioritizing one thing and then pushing everything else to the side, and maybe even like not being able to deal with those things at all. And that creates like other problems that exist in your life. The second is that you just become worse at everything. And I think this is like where the challenge is that like as much as we'd like to think, well, if I care enough or if I push enough willpower into my life, that I can just do everything and become good at it, is that we as humans don't work that way. And it would be great if we could just have enough motivation and discipline to like power through everything. But the truth is that like we can only do that for so long. Temporarily, absolutely. But there does happen where when people have real burnout, that they become worse at everything, and that like what they could get done in 2 hours of time becomes what they now takes them 4 hours. Or maybe you were super attentive to a relationship or to your kids, whatever it might be, and that you're still doing that, but like you're doing it with like less enthusiasm, or you become less receptive to other things. And this comes from not making time for yourself, because when we make time for ourselves, we have this ability to recharge and reset and feel more balanced in life. And if we don't do that, the things that we focus on instead become harder. And these are kind of like the two ways that like burnout can affect things. And this is why like making time for yourself, it's not even just about yourself, but it's about like the other things that you want to do. If you want to become better at your job, as like a parent, as friends to other people, whatever that might be, your business, making some time for yourself is going to allow you to reset, recharge. You're going to feel like you're taking care of yourself, and that gives you the ability to help other people in a better way. And I think like, so even making time for yourself, in my opinion, makes you better at the other things in your life. And this is what we see with people who are like, even people who are like really, really busy, will still get like 20-minute workouts in, 30-minute workouts in, like week to week. They have something that they're doing, whether that's reading, whether that's like self-care, like, you know, like an hour to themselves every week. That time to themselves allows them to be better at the other things in their life, as well as allows them to not hate the other things in their life. Because I think there can be some, not hatred, I think this relates more to like people with like busy jobs or like friends and things like that, as opposed to like kids. But they take so much away from you that there's almost like a, not like a hate is too strong, but they're taking things away from you, and you don't like that, is like kind of what I'm going with here. And you don't want that. You don't want that for them, whoever that might be. And being able to make time for yourself is going to allow you to still enjoy those other things and excel at those other things, and allows you to have like a more balanced life and still make yourself enough of a priority. And I think like that's something that's like super valuable. So making time for yourself, there shouldn't be guilt about it, not only because you deserve time off and time to yourself and self-care, but that self-care is still going to make you better at the other things anyways. So it ends up being like, it's not all or nothing. You end up getting both, which I think is really important. Now, some people's guilt doesn't necessarily come from themselves. And I think this is important to talk about as well, is that sometimes it's inner, and like we've kind of talked about that already on like there's like a lot of self-guilt that exists around not taking time to strength train. But there's also like sometimes this is guilt from your parents, or sometimes this is guilt from other parents that exist, or friends, or your boss, or whatever it might be. And I'm going to give kind of like a piece of advice that I think helps that. And this is going to be easier said than done, unfortunately. This is not one of those things that's like, I can implement this right away. This is something that you want to kind of like practice, and the more that you can do it, the easier it's going to be and the more value it's going to have. And that is like to stop caring as much about what other people think. Now, I want to be like really careful about how I say this, because I don't want this to be a way of like, yeah, I don't care, I'm better than other people, like I know better. That's not what I'm going with here. What I'm going with here is that you can't let other people dictate how your life goes, and you need to prioritize what you think is right and the things that matter to you. And the more that you let other people dictate that, the harder it's going to be for your life. And like, how does this relate to guilt and strength training? So there are other parents who don't make that time and feel like they shouldn't make that time. There are other like moms who aren't strength training because they are quote unquote like so dedicated to their kids, as an example. And this mentality can make other moms feel like guilty for making that time. And we're not caring about what they think, not because we're like better or that we know better, but we're not caring about what they think because we got to prioritize what we think is right, and we have to live for ourselves, not for the approval of insert person as like an example. We still want you to do what you think is the right thing. It doesn't mean that you can't take advice from other people. I'm never going to tell you like not to, that you literally know better than absolutely everyone. And like, that's why you shouldn't care what people think, but you should not base your decisions on like, well, what if this person thinks that it's a bad idea? That's what I'm going with here. This is easier said than done, especially if this like already affects you, that you're not going to just be like, okay, I'm just not going to care anymore. Like, this is kind of a practice that takes time. It's probably going to happen in a small way as opposed to like a larger way. But what I've noticed, both for like the women that I've worked with, as well as like for my own life, is that the more that I've just focused on like what I care about and what I think is the right thing, and less about like how other people are going to perceive it, you're just happier. You're more fulfilled. You're not living for someone else. You're not living, you're not going to not do something if they're like, oh, what's that person going to think? Gives you a lot more freedom. And if the judgment affects you less, that just gives you the freedom to do whatever you want, including strength training. And so if the other moms aren't strength training, but it still matters to you, you get to focus on that, which is great. And then you still have that in your life, and you know that it's good for you. And if like, other people in your life disagree with making that time for yourself, that like, it's right for you, and that you don't have to worry about all those other people who like might judge you for not doing that. So there's guilt from other sources that exist. And there's also guilt from like yourself as an example. And these do overlap. I want to be like very clear. Sometimes you feel like it's from yourself, but then you think about it more and you realize it's more from like your parents or boss, etc. as kind of an example. That's like way too deep for this podcast, but like, that does exist, that you might have both of these guilts at the same time, and they might actually be for the same reason, as like kind of an example. The one thing I want to talk about as well, this is going to relate more to parents who have young kids or even like older kids. And it also might relate to yourself if you have friends who are aware of your strength training journey. And that is setting an example for other people. I think that it's hard to believe you can do something if you don't know anybody else who's done that first, as an example. Like if there's no life example of someone doing that, I think for a lot of people, it becomes really tough to believe that you could also do it, as an example. Like you need someone who's like, oh, they've done it, like I can do it too, kind of thing. If you make time for training and time for self-care, you set an example for other people to believe they can as well. So there's like a higher purpose. There would be like there's more benefit than like just yourself. You can set an example for, your kids growing up, that they know that they can make time for themselves. And that's an important thing that they can implement in their life. Or other friends who in similar circumstances who don't think that they can make time for themselves. And then you show them that there like is a way. And to be clear, you're not showing them and like, look how much better off I'm doing than you. I want to be like very clear on that. You're just, you're sharing your journey when asked. They might get inspired to do the same. That's kind of what I'm looking for here. And that's what I'm trying to talk about. And being able to set that example and show that making time for yourself isn't a bad thing has a lot of value, and your journey can go far beyond just yourself. And this doesn't have to be the main reason that you make time for strength training or don't have guilt around it, but this is kind of like an added bonus that can happen. Let me know what your thoughts are. I think this is a really important topic because we can always talk about like how to make more time. I'm going to have further episodes on how to make time for strength training, but I need you to make sure that there's not like guilt towards starting that process for you, because I know this is a real concern that exists. I'm not shaming anybody for having this guilt, but I really think that overcoming this, or even like mildly overcoming this, or as much as you can, is going to make your strength training journey better, as well as like make other aspects of your life better. Let me know what you think. You can always send me an email, strongwithmark@gmail.com, or you can send me a DM on Instagram @TrainingStrongWomen if you have questions about how to get over this guilt, because I know it's going to be more than just this episode that's going to make you be like, okay, now I don't have guilt anymore. But if you do have any questions about this, let me know. But thanks for listening to another episode of Who's Lifting Today.